There's a specific kind of courage that doesn't look like courage at all from the outside. It doesn't arrive with noise. It doesn't announce itself with a dramatic gesture or a prepared statement. It looks from a distance like composure, like stillness, like someone who has simply decided, after a very long time in a very private place, that the weight of not speaking has finally become heavier than the weight of what still needs to be said. That is what happened with Annie Guthrie. For months, and in some ways, for years, she had been carrying something, not quietly by choice exactly, but quietly by necessity, by the particular, relentless demands of a life that had become, in ways she never entirely planned for, something much larger than herself, a life observed, measured, discussed, freely by people who had never met her and never would, people who had nonetheless formed confident opinions about who she was and what her story meant. She smiled through it. She showed up every single time. She maintained the things that needed maintaining and held the things that needed holding. And she kept the parts of her story that were truly hers tucked so far from public view that most people simply assumed there was nothing there to find. They were wrong. Because when Annie Guthrie finally spoke, when the silence that had been building, layer by careful layer, finally gave way, what came out was not what anyone had prepared themselves for. It wasn't neat. It wasn't packaged. It wasn't the smoothed-over version of events that public figures tend to offer when they've had sufficient time to decide how the story should land. It was something rawer than that, something more honest, something that reframed not just a recent chapter of her life, but the entire arc of it in ways that left people genuinely unsettled, not because of what it said about her, but because of what it said about everything she had been carrying alone, quietly, while no one was looking closely enough to see it. To understand why Annie Guthrie's silence mattered so much, and why its breaking mattered even more, you have to go back, not to the moment the story became public, not to the headlines that tried to contain it. You have to go back to who she was before she became someone the world felt it already knew. She was not someone who arrived in the public consciousness through drama or crisis. She came through something steadier and slower than that, through work, through the specific kind of presence that accumulates over time rather than arriving all at once. In a burst of visibility, she was someone who built things gradually, with patience, with intention, with care, someone who understood, in a way that not everyone manages to, that the most durable things in a life are almost always the ones constructed without shortcuts. People who knew her in her earlier years, before the visibility settled on her, before the weight that comes with it became a constant companion, describe a woman who was perceptive in a way that sometimes genuinely surprised people. She noticed things others let pass. She remembered details that most people allowed to slip. She had a quality of attentiveness, a quality of genuine presence, that made the people around her feel actually seen rather than merely acknowledged. And that quality was never strategic. It wasn't something she deployed. It was simply the way she moved through the world, toward people, toward what was real in them, toward whatever was being left unsaid. Her relationship with the public life she eventually inhabited was always more complicated than it appeared from the outside. She had not set out to be observed. She had set out to do things she believed in, and the observation had followed, the way it sometimes does for people who are genuinely, quietly good at what they do. Visibility, for her, was always a byproduct of substance rather than the goal itself, and that distinction shaped how she held it, always with a degree of discomfort, always with a quiet, firm insistence on keeping the parts of her life that were private protected from the parts that were not. She understood, perhaps more clearly than most people in her position, that not everything survives being watched. She was also, by the accounts of those who knew her well, someone who carried a great deal internally, not in a way that produced drama or visible breakdown. She was too composed for that, almost frustratingly so, but in the way that certain people absorb difficulty, without externalizing it. They take it in, they process it somewhere no one else can access, and then they continue, with such consistency and apparent steadiness that the people around them sometimes simply forget to ask if they are all right, because from the outside, the question never quite seems urgent enough. The story that Annie Guthrie eventually chose to tell, the one she had been deciding whether to tell for far longer than most people realized, was the story of what that internal carrying had actually looked like, up close, what it had cost her, what it had revealed about the gap between the life she was genuinely living and the life that was being observed and assumed and quietly constructed by people watching from the outside with only partial information and complete confidence. What that story turned out to contain was more than anyone had truly prepared themselves to hear for a long time. The life Annie Guthrie was living looked, from every available angle, like one that was working. Not perfectly, she would be the first person to say so, but functionally, with the particular texture of stability that comes when someone has worked hard to build something real and the building has, against the odds, actually held. She had relationships that mattered to her, work that gave her genuine purpose rather than mere occupation, a daily rhythm that felt, most of the time, like something she had actively chosen rather than something that had simply accumulated around her. Those things are not small. In a world that makes genuine stability surprisingly, stubbornly difficult to find, those things are actually quite a lot. The people closest to her during this period describe someone who was fully engaged with her life, present in it, active in it, not merely going through the motions with the hollow proficiency of someone performing a life, rather than living one. She had opinions and she shared them. She had commitments and she honored them without needing to be reminded. She laughed in a way that was real, not performed, the kind of laugh that arrives before there is time to decide whether to allow it. She asked questions in conversation that showed she had actually been listening to the answers from the last one. These are small things taken individually. Together, they form a portrait of someone who was genuinely, fully there. She also had a quality that the people who loved her spoke about with real consistency. She was the person in the room who made difficulty feel more manageable, not by dismissing it, not by minimizing it into something smaller than it was, but by holding it steadily alongside the people who were carrying it, so they didn't have to carry it entirely alone. She had a rare gift for presence in exactly the moments when presence is what someone needs most. And because of that gift, because she gave it so freely and so consistently, she spent a great deal of her own energy tending other people's difficult moments, which sometimes meant that her own went unaddressed for longer than was good for her. Even during this more stable period, there were things that were not entirely right, things she was quietly aware of but hadn't yet found a way to name out loud, not to others, and sometimes not even fully to herself. Small misalignments between the life she was presenting and the life she was privately experiencing. Nothing as deliberate as deception, more like the ordinary, very human gap between the version of yourself you put forward into the world and the fuller, messier, more complicated version that only you fully inhabit. Alone, at the end of the day, she was managing that gap. Most people do, to some degree, but the gap was there, and the things living quietly inside it were not insignificant. Looking back, the people who knew her well during this period say they could feel something building. Not a crisis, nothing sharp enough to be called an emergency, but a kind of pressure accumulating in the spaces between conversations, a quality of withheld something. They didn't have a name for it then. They understand now exactly what it was. It was a story waiting to find a way to be told. It was a truth still quietly deciding whether the world was safe enough to become itself in. There is no precise moment at which stillness becomes unsustainable. It happens through accumulation rather than through any single event. One thing adds to another, and then another, and eventually the weight exceeds what the structure beneath it was ever designed to carry. And then, one way or another, something gives. For Annie Guthrie, the process began with a shift, one she would later describe, in the careful and considered language of someone who has turned something over in their mind, for a very long time, as a slow realization, not a sudden revelation, not a confrontation or a discovery, a realization, the kind that arrives so gradually, so incrementally, that by the time you understand you've had it, you genuinely cannot remember a time when it wasn't there. Hovering just beneath the surface of your awareness, what she began to understand, according to accounts that emerged in the period leading up to her eventual decision to speak, was that the story being told about her life the version circulating freely in the spaces she had no control over, being assumed and repeated and quietly solidified into something approaching an unofficial. When Annie Guthrie finally made the decision to speak, she did not do it carelessly. She chose her moment. She chose her words. She chose the form it would take and the specific context in which it would be received, with the kind of careful intentionality that she brought to everything that genuinely mattered to her. And then she spoke, calmly, without performance, in the particular register of someone who has been rehearsing not the words themselves, but the courage that is required to say them, and who has finally, at real and significant personal cost, arrived at that courage. What she said reframed things in ways that were immediate and, to many people, deeply unexpected. She addressed the gap directly, the gap between the version of her life that had been circulating in the world and the version she had actually been living inside. She spoke about things she had experienced that had not been visible from the outside, pressures she had been under, dynamics she had been quietly navigating, aspects of her situation that the simplified and externally constructed account had never contained, because it had been built without her participation. She did not do this with anger. She did not use the pointed language of someone trying to wound or to win. She did it with measured, carefully considered clarity, the clarity of someone making a record, setting something straight, saying, plainly and without decoration, this is what was actually true. According to reports of her account, what she described touched on elements of her situation that had been either entirely unknown or significantly misunderstood by most people who had been following the story from the outside. The emotional complexity of what she had been carrying was deeper than the external picture had ever suggested. The decisions she had made, the silences she had chosen to maintain, the aspects of her experience she had held back, had not been arbitrary. They had been made for reasons that, when she finally articulated them fully, carried a kind of internal logic that was genuinely hard to argue with. The response to what she said was significant and immediate, not uniformly positive. These things never are, and she had been realistic and clear-eyed enough about that to have already made a certain peace with it before she spoke. But the response was real. It landed in a way that changed something in the conversation that had been building toward a particular predetermined conclusion. That conversation now had to account for information it had not previously contained. It had to make room for a perspective it had been constructing without. Questions were raised, questions that had not been formally addressed before her account entered the public record. No official conclusions have been reached. The matter, in several of its ongoing dimensions, remains under examination. But the framework had genuinely shifted. The territory was different now, in ways that could not be undone. And the story that had been quietly being written about her, without her voice anywhere in it, could no longer continue moving in quite the same direction. She had entered the room, and the room had changed. In the days and weeks that followed, as the initial response to Annie Guthrie's account settled, and the first wave of reaction gave way to something slower and more considered, a different kind of examination began to take shape, one that was less focused on the specific content of what she had said and more genuinely interested in what the fact of her having said it revealed about something larger. Because the more closely you sit with a story like this one, the story of someone who held a significant truth privately for a significant amount of time and then, with deliberation and at personal cost, finally released it, the more you begin to understand that the story is not only about that individual person, it is also about the conditions that made the holding necessary in the first place, about the structures, social, professional, relational, that created an environment in which silence was the more manageable option, for as long as it was, about what it genuinely costs a person to operate inside those structures over an extended period of time, and what it actually means when someone finally, quietly decides that the cost is no longer worth what it's demanding. Annie Guthrie had been navigating, according to her own account and the accounts of those who knew her situation closely, a set of pressures that were both specific to her particular circumstances and broadly recognizable to anyone who has ever found themselves holding a truth that simply does not fit the narrative that others have already decided is accurate. That is a deeply uncomfortable position to inhabit for any length of time. It requires a person to simultaneously manage their own lived experience of reality, and the gap between that experience and the version of it that exists in the world outside. That is not a small psychological undertaking. That is, in fact, an exhausting one, and the exhaustion compounds over time, quietly and without announcing itself, until it becomes something that affects everything. What her account ultimately contributed to the public conversation, beyond the specific details of her particular situation, was something that may prove more durable than any single piece of information she offered. It was an example, a lived, visible example of what it looks like when someone who has been managing that gap simply decides they are done managing it, when they decide that their version of events deserves to occupy real space, even if that space has to be actively created rather than simply found waiting. The questions that her account opened remain, in several of their dimensions, genuinely unresolved. No official conclusions have been reached about certain aspects of what she described. The full picture, as is so often the case in situations of genuine complexity, has not yet come entirely into focus. What has come into focus, more clearly, perhaps, than at any previous point, is the person at the center of it, and what that clarity reveals is someone who is, at her core, more interested in accuracy than in comfort, more committed to the real version of events than to the manageable one. That is a relatively rare quality, and it is, in the end, precisely what made her silence so notable and its breaking so significant. When something like this finishes moving through the public conversation, when the initial surge of response settles, when the immediate reactions give way to quieter and slower thought, what you are left with is not the noise. The noise fades. It always does. What stays is the person. And in this case, the person who stays is someone worth thinking about carefully and honestly, and without the shortcuts. Annie Guthrie is not a story. She is a human being who had an experience of genuine and significant complexity, and who chose, after a long period of carrying it entirely privately, to speak about it in public, on her own terms, in her own time. That choice and the timing of it, and the particular quality of honesty and composure she brought to the act of making it, those things tell you more about who she actually is than anything that was said or assumed or quietly decided about her during all the months and years of silence that came before. She held something difficult for longer than most people could have managed. She held it without the kind of collapse or outburst that would have given the world an easy and convenient story to tell about her. She maintained the external functioning of a life that was, internally, far more complicated than it appeared to anyone watching. And then, when she finally determined that the time had come, when the internal calculation had settled into something she could act on, she spoke with a composure and a precision that were entirely, recognizably her own, consistent with who she had always been, consistent with the person her closest friends had always known was there, even when the rest of the world was working from a different and thinner version. There is something that deserves to be named in that. Not as celebration. She would likely be genuinely uncomfortable with that framing, and she has earned the right to be, but as simple, honest recognition. The capacity to carry something difficult quietly, without losing yourself inside it, is genuinely rare. The additional capacity to then surface from that carrying and offer a clear, unguarded, honest account of what the experience actually looked like from the inside, that is rarer still, and it deserves to be acknowledged as such. What her story ultimately reflects is something much larger than her own specific circumstances. It reflects a universal human experience, the experience of inhabiting a private reality that does not match the public one, of knowing something to be true, deeply and personally true, and finding the environment around you either unable or actively unwilling to accommodate that truth, of waiting and weighing, and finally arriving at the moment when you decide that the gap has to close, and that you are the only person who can close it. Most people who have ever held a difficult truth privately will recognize something in this story. Not the specific details, those belong to her and to the people whose lives intersect with hers, but the emotional architecture of it, the particular weight of the holding, the grinding exhaustion of the management, the specific mixture of relief and terror that comes from finally allowing something to become real in the shared world, rather than only in the private one, where only you can feel its weight. That recognition is not nothing. It may, in fact, be the most important thing this story has to offer, more important than any specific revelation, more durable than any particular